19, and the negative votes are 211. The combined determination is succeeded. Without resistance, the petition to reassess is positioned on the surface. The celebrations burst on the House chamber as MAGA Mike Johnson and Donald Trump confronted another mortifying loss. By a ballot of 219 to 211, the House of Representatives balloted to prohibit or prevent Donald Trump's tariffs against Canada to withdraw those tariffs. Now, this succeeds, naturally, what occurred yesterday when MAGA Mike Johnson endeavored to introduce what's designated a regulation to the chamber, which would have blocked the House of Representatives from balloting to prevent Donald Trump's tariffs against Canada, Mexico, or the remainder of the planet for a complete period. So, MAGA Mike endeavored to prevent the discussion to block Congress from even executing this ballot to prevent Donald Trump's tariffs against the planet. MAGA Mike was defeated yesterday by a meaningful quantity as well. 217 opposed to the regulation and exclusively 214 supporting of the regulation. And because balloting to prevent Donald Trump's tariffs against the planet is something designated a favored determination, Democrats were capable to introduce it to the House chamber for a ballot yesterday. And the Democrats, along with 6 Republicans, balloted opposed to Donald Trump's Canada tariffs. And this was a substantial defeat for Donald Trump and MAGA Mike Johnson. Here are the 6 Republicans who balloted opposed to Trump and combined with the Democrats: Thomas Massie, Don Bacon, Brian Fitzpatrick, Jeff Hurd, Kevin Kiley, and Dan Newhouse. Now, this succeeds Donald Trump warning any Republican in the House who would attempt ballot opposed to him, and MAGA Mike Johnson would experience severe repercussions. Well, the Republicans resisted him in MAGA Mike. The Republicans criticized him, and those 6 Republicans, at minimum, combined with Democrats in the House of Representatives. People, the barrier has collapsed and Donald Trump is failing each and every interval. Here's what Trump transmitted. Any Republican in the House or Senate that ballots opposed to the tariffs will genuinely experience the repercussions arrive vote duration, and that encompasses preliminary contests. Our commercial shortage has been diminished by 78%. The Dow Jones has merely reached 50,000 and the S&P 7,000. All figures that were regarded unachievable merely one period earlier. Genuinely, our shortage has reduced 78%. You're merely fabricating figures. Donald Trump proceeds on to communicate. In supplementary, tariffs have provided us excellent state protection because the simple reference of the term has nations consenting to our most powerful desires. Tariffs have provided us financial and state protection, and 0 Republican should be accountable for obliterating this advantage. President Donald J. Trump, the advantage is in Article 1 of the Constitution. The authority belongs to Congress. Congress possesses the authority over levies, and tariffs are a configuration of levy. So if genuinely that advantage as you designate it, or what appears to be a condemnation, is desired because 95% of it's transferred on to buyers, which is why inflation is increasing, and genuinely why we possessed an employment recession previous period. Congress can succeed a legislation, but Congress doesn't desire this. They merely criticized you. Donald Trump also transmitted the succeeding communication as well. Correct. As these tariffs against the planet by Trump were criticized by Congress, Trump transmits, Canada has exploited the United States on commerce for numerous periods. They are throughout the most terrible in the planet to address with, particularly as it connects to our northern boundary. Tariffs create a victory for us simple. Simple Republicans must maintain it, that approach. President Donald J. Trump. Now, we recognize that Donald Trump always assaults Canada, defames Canada, designates it the 51st territory, assaults its independence. But what renders this particularly revolting is that for anybody monitoring planet occurrences in British Columbia, Canada merely experienced a substantial academy shooting at an academy in British Columbia where 9 innocent individuals forfeited their existences. Shooter executed his personal existence as well. 25 individuals seriously damaged. Primarily, all the nations throughout the planet contacted Canada to demonstrate sorrow standing with Canada. You recognize, when I received from Prime Minister Carney, initial in the interval, He referenced all the nations that contacted him. He didn't reference the United States. Instead, Donald Trump, instead than demonstrating compassion and sorrow for what's transpiring in Canada presently, Donald Trump transmits this assault. At the identical duration, Congress balloted to withdraw, eliminate, criticize. You select the R term, you select whatever you desire to designate it, but cease the tariffs. Congress Representative Don Bacon, Republican, composes the succeeding. Congress possesses Article 1 constitutional obligation on tariffs. We cannot and should not delegate our obligations. As a traditional conservative, I recognize tariffs are a levy on the American buyers. I recognize some dispute, but this discussion and ballot should transpire in the House. We also received from Gary Shapiro, who was retransmitted by Don Bacon. These tariffs aren't calculated. They create products less manageable, pressure producers, and decelerate enterprises. Appreciation to House Democrats and Kevin Kiley, Don Bacon, and Massie for dismissing yesterday's systematic petition and maintaining congressional power on commerce. And as Brendan Duke clarifies and is retransmitted by Don Bacon, remarkable, the Congressional Budget Office merely emerged with its recent calculations, and it calculates that U.S. buyers sustain 95% of the Trump tariffs. Essentially, international organizations sustain 5% of them. U.S. organizations sustain 30% of them, but alternative U.S. organizations receive to elevate values on buyers from reduced rivalry, so that totals to zero and buyers compensate the remainder. And Don Bacon retransmits Scott Lincecum communicating, astonished, I inform you, that the CBO would locate essentially the identical element regarding tariff occurrences that the St. Louis Fed, the Kiel Institute, Tax Foundation, Harvard Business School, and alternative sources have located. Astonished, I inform you. State administration information, which designates itself Fox, is communicating tariff disruption. The House succeeded legislation intended at reversing Trump's tariffs on Canada, with multiple Republicans combining Democrats for an infrequent criticism of Donald Trump. By the approach, merely examine right here at some of these data. We executed this evaluation utilizing the Yale Budget Lab and CBO and Joint Committee on Taxation materials. The Trump Republican expense of existing in MAGA Mike's territory elevated about $2,000 average for 298,000 operating and middle category households in Louisiana's 4th congressional territory. The identical evaluation for Steve Scalise's territory elevated expenses about $2,000 as well, identical element for MAGA Republican Tom Emmer's territory. This duration of period when it's frigid and obscure by meal duration, all I desire is something heated, soothing, and simple. The final element I desire to execute following an extended interval is overcomplicate meal. That's why I've been appreciating Home Chef. It arrives at my entrance with fresh, pre-measured components, simple formulas to pursue, and meals that genuinely experience excellent. I've endeavored everything from their traditional meal containers to the rapid alternatives, and honestly, the heating-prepared containers have been a rescuer on occupied evenings. Everything is established step by step, extremely simple, and the meals experience restaurant caliber without the pressure. They functioned with culinary experts like Gordon Ramsay to introduce remarkable formulas directly to your residence. And you'll locate these culinary expert-motivated formulas throughout Home Chef's culinary assembly, traditional meal containers, and rapid alternatives, and individuals genuinely appreciate it. Home Chef is evaluated number 1 by consumers of alternative meal containers for caliber, convenience, worth, experience, and formula simplicity. There are exceeding 30 meal alternatives each period, encompassing 30-minute meals, heating lunches, and including a committed household selection for 4 or 6 portion meals. Additionally, Home Chef buyers preserve an average of $86 per period on provisions. Previous period, I possessed Ramsay's crispy sesame seafood with peas and yuzu salad, and I experienced like I was consuming at a pleasant establishment. For a restricted duration, Home Chef is presenting my audiences 50% reduction and complimentary dispatch for your initial container. Additionally, complimentary suite for existence. Proceed to homechef.com Midas. That's homechef.com Midas for 50% reduction your initial container and complimentary suite for existence. Homechef.com Midas participant must be a functioning follower to obtain complimentary suite. Now, MAGA Mike was questioned what he believed about this House determination rescinding Trump's Canada tariffs, which is a substantial criticism of him and Donald Trump. And MAGA Mike's, he's not disturbed. He'll merely reject it. He'll merely reject it. He'll merely reject it. Acceptable. Well, if there is a super superiority, he can reject it. But in any circumstance, including if he rejects it, we presently possess all of the Republicans in the House and approaching to be in the Senate on documentation about where they position on generating these substantial levy elevations on the American individuals who are experiencing. MAGA Mike, because these are being compensated by the American buyer, observe what MAGA Mike has to communicate. Execute this segment. Either they won't succeed the House adaptation of the legislation corresponding as my anticipation's presidency will be if Republicans resist him on tariffs presently. He's not disturbed. I merely departed the White House. He comprehends what's transpiring. It's not going to influence or transform his strategy. He can reject these elements if they arrive to us. The president's commerce strategies are functioning. Observe the financial materials. Observe the securities exchange above 50,000. Observe the diminishment in the commerce shortage by 78%. The figure merely emerged. There's zero justification to reverse direction presently. We'll observe. Appreciation. Also, MAGA Mike was again questioned today by Manu Raju, who executes an excellent occupation on Capitol Hill. Recognition tipped him. Recognition tip to our DC department as well, guided by Pablo Manriquez, who executes an excellent occupation. But here, Manu Raju was questioning MAGA Mike about Donald Trump's DOJ proceeding following those 6 Democratic legislators, the 2 senators, and the previous representatives of the House of Representatives for creating a recording communicating that our soldiers should not comply unlawful commands, which is merely a repetition of the legislation. MAGA Mike, who's anticipated to still defend Article 1 and elements like communication or discussion and the First Amendment, he doesn't because he's a Trump subordinate. He's a sycophant. Observe what MAGA Mike communicates as he somewhat departs away from Manu Raju. Execute this segment. The administration unsuccessful and to obtain this charge against those 6 Democrats. You have been extended opposed to weaponizing the Justice Department. How can you communicate this is not being weaponized when they're proceeding following Democrats and they're not capable to obtain a charge? I am extremely substantially and extremely consistently opposed to the Department of Justice being weaponized in any approach. Throughout the 4 periods of the Biden-Harris administration, they were participating in an open legal warfare, and we created substantial disruption about that. And isn't that precisely what's transpiring presently? Permit me inform you what is distinct here. Initially, I haven't observed any of the materials on the charge that was being pursued in this, and I am a lifelong supporter and a protective supporter of the First Amendment and unrestricted communication. I utilized to prosecute those matters for 20 periods. But I would inform you that a boundary is violated, and it's extremely substantial when you possess leaders here in the Senate and the House efficiently informing representatives of the armed forces to resist commands, and that is precisely the statements that they utilize. And some of these are extremely respected previous armed forces personnel, and you recognize one of them is a senator who you recognize possessed an extended and celebrated profession. So it possesses an impact on young service representatives. It's an extremely hazardous strategy that they were executing. Should they be transmitted to detention? Presumably not, but we require to identify it as being extremely unsuitable, and they required to. Believed this was fascinating materials as well. So in monetary period 2013, for instance, as Aaron Blake indicates, government grand tribunals dismissed charges merely 5 durations out of 165,000 matters. Grand tribunals have presently dismissed Trump administration charges for one of the three Comey allegations: sandwich individual, multiple alternative objectors, Letitia James again, presently 6 congressional Democrats. And by the approach, we've observed multiple of matters be dismissed by grand tribunals under the Trump administration. Also, we appear to be approaching towards a termination of the Department of Homeland Security. Senator Thune, who's the Senate leader, and MAGA Mike Johnson are essentially communicating, "We're not going to be capable to create an arrangement with Democrats." We'll observe what transpires because the MAGA Republicans decline to possess the face coverings eliminated from ICE operatives, decline to possess ICE operatives blocked from proceeding to the balloting locations, considerably despicable fundamental material. Furnish legal authorizations. Oh my goodness. The Fourth Amendment, unreasonable investigation and confiscations. Remarkable. Remarkably remarkable. Let's execute over here. You possess Enton over on CNN. Merely demonstrates you how unpopular these tariffs are opposed to Canada. And you recognize and why the American individuals' position with Canada. It's Donald Trump's ridiculous animosity of Canada, his malice. Here, execute this segment there. Canadians' evaluation of Trump's initial period. Observe this. Initial period of his subsequent period, 66% provide him an enormous substantial F. F is an unsuccessful compared to merely 6% who provide him an A. And maintain in consideration that this 66% encompasses a majority of representatives of each solitary faction in Canada. It doesn't subject if you're on the progressive or the traditional. You do not appreciate Donald Trump if you are a Canadian. So if he executed Create Canada, the 51st territory, and operated for a third period, it appears improbable he would receive Canada's electoral ballots. It would appear remarkably improbable that he would receive Canadians' electoral ballots, and I will recognize that they genuinely don't desire to transform the 51st Territory surveying presence. How about the alternative direction? U.S. perspectives of Canada. Acceptable. So if Canadians genuinely don't appreciate Donald Trump, how do Americans experience about Canada? Well, they genuinely appreciate Canada. Observe this. The total popularity evaluation of Canada throughout Americans, throughout all adults, it's plus 46. Democrats plus 64, Independents plus 46, and including throughout Republicans, it's plus 30. Canada was the most popular nation examined by this recent survey from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And I will recognize naturally that this plus 46 is meaningfully elevated than Donald Trump's personal total popularity evaluation here in America. So, Canada additional popular than Donald Trump in Donald Trump's personal nation. Well, that's something. Acceptable. How has travel been influenced by all of this? Yeah, acceptable. So you recognize it possessed the tariffs, you recognize, then naturally their complete bridge circumstance, but here's the element, which is there are genuine travel currency at risk. And examine here, travel in 2025 versus 2024. Canadians to America, observe that. Down approach, down 25%. Americans to Canada, merely down about 2%. Essentially consistent. Canadians genuinely executing their indignation by not arriving to the nation of the United States of America, not investing their travel currency. Well, Americans are essentially proceeding to Canada in the identical figures. And this naturally subjects because my contacts inform me that Canadians constitute the most substantial figure of guests to the United States of any nation on all the planet Earth. Acceptable. You referenced tariffs. There is a substantial Supreme Court judgment we are anticipating on and have been anticipating on whether numerous of the president's tariffs are legitimate. What are the forecast exchanges communicating about that? Yeah, acceptable. So all this might be for not because merely examine here the probability Supreme Court determines opposed to Trump's tariffs 70% according to the Kalshi Forecast Exchange. 70% probability. So all of this governmental anxiety, all of this currency forfeited to travel, And it might all be for not, because probabilities are at minimum according to those who are positioning their currency where their communication is that the Supreme Court is going to determine opposed to Trump's tariffs someday. Ultimately, we don't recognize when it's going to be. Acceptable, Harry, and appreciation. There you possess it, people. Permit me recognize what you believe about all of this. Impact subscribe. Assist us receive to 6 million followers. We appreciate you all so substantially. Appreciation for everything, everybody. Appreciation for observing. Be certain to append the Midas Touch transmission on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you receive your transmission for new updates each solitary interval.